The photograph is small, barely larger than a hand, its edges soft with age and fingerprints. At first glance, it is ordinary, comfortingly so. A woman in a plain wool coat kneels in the dirt, her arms wrapped tightly around a boy no older than 7. Dust clings to their shoes. Hunger and hardship linger in the lines of her face. It is 1931, etched in pencil on the back, a year when holding on to anything warm felt like an act of survival. Most people who see the image linger on the woman. Her eyes are closed as she presses her cheek against the child's hair, as if bracing herself against a world determined to take everything else away. Her grip is not gentle. It is desperate. The kind of embrace that suggests fear more than affection, as though letting go, even for a moment, might invite disaster. It isn't until the image is enlarged that the discomfort begins. The boy's face does not blur the way it should. Instead, it sharpens. His features feel wrong, not distorted, not grotesque, just subtly misaligned with the era, the light, the moment. His eyes are open, staring past the camera with an unsettling awareness, pupils too clear, too reflective. He is not returning the hug. His small hands hang limply at his sides, fingers slightly curled, as though he has forgotten what they are meant to do. The longer one looks, the harder it becomes to believe the boy is posing. Children fidget. They squint. They smile or scowl. This one does none of that. His expression is fixed, practiced, almost rehearsed, an imitation of childhood rather than the real thing. There is no fear in his face. No confusion. Only patience. Behind them, the background seems to bend inward, the shadows pooling unnaturally close to his outline. The woman's coat creases naturally under strain, but the boy's collar remains perfectly still, untouched by her grip. It is as if he occupies the photograph without fully belonging to it. Those who study the image often report the same sensation, the creeping feeling that the woman knows something is wrong, that her eyes are closed not in comfort, but in refusal. As though she is pretending, just for a second longer, that the thing she is holding is still her son. The photograph was not found the way important things are supposed to be found. It wasn't framed, catalogued, or protected behind glass. It was discovered inside a collapsing filing cabinet in the basement of a county records building scheduled for demolition, buried beneath tax ledgers, foreclosure notices, and brittle correspondence from families who had long since vanished from official memory. The cabinet itself had not been opened in decades. Its drawers resisted at first, then slid free with a dry groan, releasing the smell of damp paper and iron dust. Most of what lay inside was routine, dull, administrative proof of lives reduced to numbers during the worst economic collapse the country had ever known. The photograph was different immediately, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt misplaced. It was tucked inside an envelope marked only with a faded stamp and a handwritten number that did not correspond to any known index. No name. No address. Just a number, as though someone had intended to return to it later and never did. The envelope had been folded and unfolded so many times that the paper felt soft, almost fabric-like, and when it was opened, a fine layer of ash-colored dust slipped onto the table. The image itself was small, printed on thin photographic paper common to the early 1930s, the corners rounded from handling. The date 1931 was written on the back in pencil, the graphite pressed hard enough to leave an imprint on the image side. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple portrait taken outdoors, likely by a local photographer trying to earn extra money during the Depression. A woman crouched low, arms wrapped tightly around a boy standing stiffly in front of her. Their clothing was plain, worn but clean, the kind of care people took even when they had very little. There was no backdrop, no studio lighting, just dirt beneath their shoes and a washed-out horizon behind them. Archivists who initially examined the photo saw nothing remarkable. It fit neatly into a familiar historical narrative: poverty, family, survival. The woman's face carried the unmistakable strain of the era, eyes heavy, mouth set in a thin line that suggested endurance rather than hope. Her grip on the boy was firm, fingers digging into the fabric of his coat, as if she were holding on to the last solid thing in her life. Many photographs from that period captured similar moments, intimate displays of family bonds formed under pressure. What raised questions was not what the photograph showed, but why it was there at all. County records did not typically store personal portraits unless they were attached to a case file, an investigation, or an identification record. Yet no corresponding documents could be found. The number on the envelope led nowhere. The photograph existed without context, like a sentence torn from the middle of a story, its beginning and end erased. Further inspection of the surrounding files revealed an odd pattern. The drawer where the photograph was found contained records from multiple decades, some misplaced, some duplicated, as though the cabinet had been reorganized several times and never quite corrected. Pages were missing from otherwise complete files. Names were crossed out and rewritten. Dates contradicted each other. It was the kind of bureaucratic mess that accumulates when institutions endure hardship, staff shortages, and constant restructuring. Still, the presence of a single personal photograph among impersonal paperwork remained unexplained. When the image was scanned for digital preservation, the technician handling it noted that the paper stock was consistent with mass-produced photographic prints from the early 1930s, confirming the date written on the back was likely accurate. The ink density, grain pattern, and chemical aging all aligned with that period. Nothing about the material suggested forgery or later reproduction. This was not an anachronism placed among old records. It belonged to the time it claimed. The archivist assigned to log the photograph attempted to trace its origin through local photographer registries, but the angle, lighting, and lack of studio markings made attribution impossible. No stamp, no embossed signature, no handwritten dedication. Whoever took the photograph did not claim it, or the claim had been deliberately removed. Even the negative, if it ever existed, was gone. Attention then turned to the woman and the child themselves. Faces were compared against census records, employment rolls, relief program registries, and school enrollment lists from 1930 to 1932. The woman appeared vaguely familiar, her features echoing countless Depression-era portraits, but no exact match could be confirmed. The boy was more difficult. Children changed quickly, and records from that era were notoriously incomplete, especially for families displaced by poverty. Entire households disappeared from documentation when they moved, died, or simply stopped reporting. What unsettled researchers was the absence of any trace of the pair together. Individually, there were possible matches, women of similar age, boys of similar build, but no record placed them in the same household during that year. It was as though the photograph captured a relationship that did not officially exist. A mother and son with no paper trail connecting them. The longer the photograph remained under review, the more it resisted categorization. It could not be archived as a family portrait, nor could it be assigned to any known case file. It hovered between classifications, an orphaned artifact from a period already crowded with loss. Some suggested it had been mistakenly filed and belonged elsewhere, but no elsewhere could be identified. Eventually, the photograph was placed temporarily in a holding folder labeled Unassigned Materials, a category meant for items awaiting further information. It was intended to stay there briefly, until a proper context could be established. Instead, it remained untouched for years, quietly unsettling those who remembered it, not because it showed something horrific, but because it showed something almost normal, almost comforting, and yet utterly disconnected from the systems designed to remember such things, as if the moment it captured had slipped through history without permission and refused to explain why it was ever recorded at all. The first signs that something was wrong did not come from human intuition, but from software. When the photograph was scanned at a higher resolution for digital archiving, the initial goal was simple preservation. The image was fragile, and magnification would allow historians to study details without further handling the original print. The process was routine, automated, and expected to reveal nothing more than scratches, dust, and the familiar grain of early 20th century film. Instead, the restoration algorithms began flagging inconsistencies. At low magnification, the photograph behaved exactly as it should. The background dissolved into soft blur, the woman's coat showed the expected wear patterns, and the dirt beneath their feet blended into indistinct texture. But when the focus shifted toward the boy's face, the image sharpened rather than softened. Edges that should have bled into one another grew strangely precise. The bridge of his nose, the outline of his lips, the curve of his eyelids all appeared with a clarity that did not match the rest of the frame. Technicians assumed an error. Early photographic processes were unpredictable, and sometimes chemical exposure produced uneven results. They adjusted contrast, recalibrated grain reduction, and ran the image through different restoration profiles. Each time, the same anomaly emerged. The more the image was corrected, the more the boy's face resisted the logic of the era. His features did not degrade under magnification the way the woman's did. They held. What troubled the team was not just the sharpness, but the structure of it. The light on the boy's face did not behave like reflected sunlight. Highlights appeared where there should have been shadow, and shadow where the woman's body should have blocked the light entirely. The illumination was too even, too centered, as if the face had been lit independently from the rest of the scene. This was impossible with the equipment available in 1931, especially in an outdoor setting. Closer inspection revealed subtler irregularities. The boy's pupils reflected a shape that did not match the open space behind the photographer. Instead of the expected diffuse glare, there was a defined, rounded reflection, almost like a small window or aperture. No corresponding object appeared anywhere else in the photograph. The woman's eyes, partially closed as they were, showed nothing similar. As technicians zoomed further, they noticed that the boy's expression did not resolve into natural microdetails. Skin pores were oddly uniform. Fine wrinkles around the eyes, common even in children when photographed in harsh light, were absent. His face looked assembled rather than grown, smooth in a way that felt intentional. Not youthful, but finished. The most unsettling discovery came when the image was flipped horizontally, a common technique used to reveal asymmetries. The woman's face changed subtly, as expected, but remained recognizably human in its imbalance. The boy's face, however, appeared almost perfectly symmetrical. Too perfect. Human faces carry small irregularities, tiny differences that persist regardless of lighting or angle. Here, those differences were minimal, as if the face had been corrected or aligned to a central axis. Some suggested that the boy had been retouched. Photo manipulation existed in the 1930s, after all. Photographers could paint directly onto negatives or prints to enhance features or remove blemishes. But retouching usually softened faces, blurred edges, and left visible brush marks under magnification. None were present. There were no strokes, no pigment buildup, no signs of intervention. The sharpness was inherent to the image itself. Attention then turned to motion. Early cameras required subjects to remain still, and children were notorious for failing to do so. As a result, most photographs of children from that era show slight blur in the eyes, mouth, or hands. In this image, the woman's sleeve displayed faint motion softness where her arm pressed into the boy's shoulder. The boy's body showed it as well, a subtle distortion along the edge of his coat. But his face remained perfectly fixed, unaffected by the movement around it. It was as though the face existed in a different moment than the rest of the photograph. Technicians began comparing the boy's face to known artifacts of double exposure or photographic overlays. In some cases, images accidentally captured multiple moments at once, creating ghostly overlaps. But those effects produced transparency, repetition, or misalignment. The boy's face showed none of these. It was singular, solid, and anchored. When the image was isolated and layered against itself at different scales, another anomaly emerged. The grain pattern on the boy's face did not match the grain pattern on the rest of the image. Film grain is consistent across a single exposure, random but uniform. Here, the grain over the boy's features appeared finer, more controlled, as though it belonged to a different source entirely. Yet there was no visible seam where one pattern ended and another began. The more the image was studied, the less it behaved like a photograph and the more it resembled a composite that should not have been possible at the time. And yet, chemically and materially, it was one continuous print. There were no layers to separate, no edits to undo. Some of the technicians refused to continue working on it late at night. They cited eye strain, headaches, a sense of unease they couldn't articulate. One remarked that the boy's gaze seemed to follow the cursor as they moved across the screen, though this was dismissed as fatigue. Still, no one argued when the image analysis sessions were rescheduled for daytime hours. By the end of the restoration process, the team had confirmed what they could not explain. The boy's face contained information the camera should not have captured. Details too precise, lighting too controlled, symmetry too exact. The photograph had not revealed something hidden so much as it had revealed something that did not belong, something embedded seamlessly into a moment of human tenderness, waiting patiently for technology advanced enough to notice it. The discovery of the death record came not from a dramatic revelation, but from persistence bordering on obsession. Once the anomalies in the photograph had been documented, the archivist assigned to the case began cross-referencing every possible record that might anchor the image to a verifiable identity. Census rolls, parish registries, hospital logs, burial permits, school attendance lists, and relief agency intake forms were examined one by one, narrowing the search geographically based on soil composition visible in the photograph and the style of clothing worn by the woman. The process was slow, repetitive, and emotionally draining, the kind of work that rewarded patience rather than inspiration. The first breakthrough was a partial match in a rural county several hundred miles from where the photograph had been stored. A woman of similar age and appearance appeared in a 1930 census, listed as widowed, living alone on the edge of town. Her surname was common, but her given name was not. The handwriting on the census form bore a resemblance to the pencil date on the back of the photograph, not enough to prove a connection, but enough to justify deeper investigation. Her household entry listed one child, a son, aged 6. That child's name appeared again in a county hospital ledger dated late 1928. The entry was brief, clinical, and final. Cause of death was listed as pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition. The boy had been admitted in the winter and died 3 days later. The ledger noted that the body was released to the mother and buried in a public cemetery reserved for families who could not afford private plots. No photograph was attached, no physical description beyond height and hair color, and no personal effects were recorded. At first, the archivist assumed coincidence. Pneumonia deaths among children were tragically common during that period, especially in impoverished communities. Names repeated across counties, and records were often incomplete or inaccurate. Still, the dates were troubling. If the hospital record was correct, the boy would have died more than 2 years before the photograph was taken. The archivist requested burial records from the cemetery referenced in the ledger. The cemetery office, long since modernized, provided microfilm scans of interment logs from the late 1920s. There it was again. The same name. The same age. The burial date matched the hospital record exactly. The plot number was listed, along with a note indicating no headstone had been placed due to lack of funds. The grave was unmarked. What unsettled the archivist was not simply the existence of the grave, but the absence of any later correction. Sometimes, errors were discovered years afterward and amended. Children misidentified, names misspelled, even entire records reversed. Here, there were no marginal notes, no updates, no indication that the burial had been anything other than final. The boy was officially, thoroughly dead. The woman's records told a parallel story of quiet disappearance and reappearance. After her son's death, relief agency files showed her receiving aid as a single adult with no dependents. Food rations were reduced. Clothing allowances changed. Then, inexplicably, in early 1931, her status shifted. A new intake form listed her as supporting one child. No explanation was provided. No birth record, no adoption papers, no school enrollment accompanied the change. The child simply appeared in the paperwork, acknowledged but undocumented. Further investigation revealed witness statements buried in unrelated files. A neighbor's complaint about noise mentioned a child crying in the woman's house months after the recorded death. A shopkeeper's ledger noted selling children's shoes to her in the spring of 1931, size matching the deceased boy's age progression. A church attendance sheet listed her sitting with a child, unnamed, in the back pew. None of these fragments were formal enough to trigger review. Together, they formed a pattern that contradicted the finality of the burial record. The archivist traveled to the cemetery, more out of a need for closure than expectation. The plot number corresponded to a patch of uneven ground beneath a tree whose roots had long since disrupted the soil. There was no marker, no sign of maintenance. Just earth, slightly sunken, as if something had settled there permanently. Standing above it, the archivist was struck by a quiet certainty that whatever lay beneath had not changed since the day it was placed there. Back in the archive, the photograph took on a different weight. The woman's grip no longer read as maternal affection, but as insistence. Her closed eyes seemed less like exhaustion and more like refusal to acknowledge what records insisted was true. The boy's stillness, his unresponsive posture, his strange expression now aligned disturbingly well with the idea that he should not have been there at all. The final confirmation came from a school registry. The boy's name appeared briefly in a class roll from 1927, then vanished. It never reappeared in any official educational record after his death. The child listed as living with a woman in 1931 attended no school, received no vaccinations, and generated no paperwork beyond those few, stray mentions. He existed socially, visibly, but not bureaucratically, as though whatever had returned to her after the burial had learned enough to be seen, but not enough to be documented, occupying a narrow space between memory and record where no system was designed to question him. The witness accounts surfaced slowly, scattered across years and recorded only because someone, somewhere, had felt uneasy enough to write something down. They were not statements taken by police or sworn testimonies meant to establish fact. They were fragments, notes in margins, offhand remarks preserved in unrelated documents, recollections written decades later when memory had already begun to soften and distort. On their own, each account was easy to dismiss. Together, they formed a shape that could no longer be ignored. The earliest came from a neighbor who lived 2 houses down from the woman in the winter following her son's burial. In a handwritten complaint filed with the town council, she mentioned disturbances late at night, a child's footsteps pacing across a wooden floor, the creak of a door opening and closing, the sound of someone being spoken to softly for long stretches of time. The complaint was not hostile. It read more like confusion. The neighbor noted that she had attended the boy's funeral herself and could not understand who the woman was speaking to now. The complaint was filed, acknowledged, and forgotten. A year later, a traveling census worker made a marginal note in his ledger after visiting the woman's home. Officially, he recorded 1 adult and 1 child residing at the address. Unofficially, squeezed into the margin beside the entry, he wrote a single line questioning whether the child was the same one. No explanation followed. Census workers were discouraged from speculation, and the note was never referenced again. Still, it remained there, a quiet doubt preserved in pencil. Shopkeepers provided some of the most unsettling observations. A grocer's account book showed regular purchases for a small household, bread, milk, occasional meat when funds allowed. Starting in the spring of 1931, there was a noticeable increase in portions suitable for a growing child. When questioned years later as part of an oral history project, the grocer recalled the woman clearly. He remembered the boy standing beside her, silent, watching. He could not recall the boy ever speaking. When asked how old the child seemed, he hesitated, then admitted that the boy never appeared to age, at least not in the way other children did. Church records offered similar contradictions. Several parishioners remembered the woman attending services with her son seated beside her. They described him as well-behaved, unnervingly so, hands folded, eyes forward, never distracted. One woman recalled trying to engage him in conversation, only to be unsettled by the way he watched her without responding. She assumed he was shy or ill. Another parishioner remembered the boy months later and was struck by how little he had changed, how his clothes were different but his face was not. More disturbing were the accounts that emerged long after the woman herself had died. In the 1970s, a local historian collecting memories of the Depression interviewed several elderly residents who independently mentioned the same thing, the woman who lost her child but kept being seen with him. One man described watching her walk through town holding a boy's hand years after everyone knew the boy was buried. He said people stopped commenting on it after a while. It was easier, he explained, to accept what you could see than to argue with grief. A former school teacher recalled seeing the boy near the schoolyard fence on multiple occasions. He never entered the grounds, never played with the other children. He just stood there, watching classes through the windows. She assumed he was too young to be enrolled, but when she saw him again years later, he looked exactly the same. She remembered feeling a sudden, inexplicable fear and crossing the street to avoid passing too close. Some witnesses claimed the woman spoke openly about her son's return, though never directly. She never said he had come back from the dead. Instead, she spoke as if nothing had changed, as if the burial had been a mistake everyone else had misunderstood. When asked about the grave, she reportedly grew quiet, her voice tightening as she insisted that mistakes were made during difficult times and that people should trust what they could see. The consistency of the accounts was what troubled later researchers. People who had never met each other, interviewed decades apart, described the same details: the boy's silence, his fixed expression, the way he stood slightly apart from other children, the way time seemed to pass around him without effect. No one described him laughing. No one described him crying. Several noted that he never appeared sick, never injured himself, never grew tired. There were also accounts of people who tried to challenge the woman directly. One relative, distant and unnamed in surviving records, allegedly confronted her about the boy years after the funeral. According to a second-hand retelling, the woman listened calmly, then asked the relative to look at the child and tell her what was wrong. When the relative hesitated, the woman smiled and said that seeing was believing. The relative never visited again. As the years passed, sightings of the woman continued, always with the boy, until suddenly they stopped. There was no record of the boy growing into adulthood, no account of him leaving town, marrying, or dying. The woman's death was recorded plainly, her burial documented with the efficiency that had been missing decades earlier. After that, there were no more sightings. What lingered instead were the memories, passed quietly between neighbors, preserved in small, uneasy comments made when the subject arose. People spoke of the woman with a mixture of pity and discomfort, unsure whether they had witnessed a miracle, a delusion sustained by collective silence, or something far more troubling that no one had been equipped to name, something that walked beside her in broad daylight, accepted by a town that learned, slowly and without discussion, that it was better not to ask certain questions as long as the boy kept holding her hand and she kept insisting that he was exactly who he was supposed to. But the final interpretation did not arrive as a revelation but as a slow, reluctant concession, formed from the accumulation of details that refused to resolve any other way. By the time the photograph, the records, and the witness accounts were considered together, the possibility that the woman was simply mistaken, delusional, or lying no longer held. The systems designed to document reality had failed to contain what she was living with, but they had left enough gaps to suggest that something had stepped neatly into the shape of her loss. The photograph became central to this realization. When experts revisited it with the knowledge that the boy had died years earlier, the image no longer read as a keepsake. It read as evidence of a moment when substitution was already complete. The woman's posture, once interpreted as protective, now appeared corrective, as if she were positioning the boy for the camera, ensuring he looked the way he was supposed to. Her eyes were closed not in comfort, but in concentration, as though she were willing the scene to remain stable long enough to be captured. The boy's stillness, his lack of engagement with her touch, began to feel intentional rather than strange. He was present in the frame, but not participating in it. His body allowed itself to be held without response, as if physical contact were a learned behavior rather than an instinctive one. The camera did not capture a shared moment of affection. It captured compliance. Researchers began to speak quietly of replacement, not in a metaphorical sense, but in the literal one. Something had returned to the woman after her son's death, something that knew enough to resemble him, to occupy his space, to be recognized by those who wanted to see him. It did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be close enough to avoid scrutiny in a town already exhausted by hardship and grief. What unsettled historians most was how effectively the replacement functioned. It did not disrupt daily life. It did not provoke violence or hysteria. It simply existed, moving through routines with minimal interaction, drawing little attention beyond a vague sense of discomfort. It learned where to stand, when to be silent, how to look without expression. It learned that people would accept almost anything if it spared them from confronting loss. The woman's role in this became increasingly complex. There was no evidence she had summoned the thing or sought it out. There was only evidence that she accepted it immediately and completely. After the burial, she did not speak publicly of grief. She did not petition authorities or seek explanations. Instead, she adjusted. Her record shifted. Her household changed. Her life continued as though corrected. Some theorized that the replacement required belief to remain stable, that it depended on the woman's refusal to acknowledge the grave. Her closed eyes in the photograph were reinterpreted as an act of maintenance, a deliberate turning away from contradiction. As long as she did not look too closely, as long as she treated the boy as her son, the illusion held. The town, too, played its part. Neighbors noticed inconsistencies, but they chose familiarity over truth. They spoke around the subject, not through it. In doing so, they created a social environment where the replacement could persist unchallenged. It was never forced to explain itself. No one demanded proof. The dead child remained in the ground, officially and unambiguously, while something else walked above it, benefiting from the silence of those who preferred not to reconcile the two. The most disturbing conclusion emerged from the absence of an ending. There was no record of the boy leaving, aging, or dying. He did not transition into adulthood. He did not require new documentation. He existed only as long as the woman did. When she died, the sighting stopped. Not gradually. Completely. This led to the final, chilling interpretation: the replacement was never meant to last beyond her. It was not an independent being moving through the world. It was something tethered to her need, sustained by her recognition, anchored to the role she assigned it. When she was gone, there was no one left who needed it to be her son. The photograph, then, was not a warning or a mystery meant to be solved. It was a record of a successful exchange. A moment when loss was quietly overwritten, when grief was answered not with healing, but with accommodation. The camera did not capture the return of a dead child. It captured the precise instant when a mother decided that resemblance was enough, that presence mattered more than truth, and that whatever stood in front of her, silent and watching, could remain as long as it allowed her to keep holding something shaped like her son. Years later, when the photograph was finally sealed away in a restricted archive, it was labeled with language carefully chosen to sound neutral. No conclusions were stated. No theories endorsed. It was described only as an unidentified family image, origin uncertain, context disputed. The kind of description meant to quiet curiosity rather than invite it. But images have a way of outlasting the intentions placed upon them. Occasionally, a researcher would request access, drawn by rumors that circulated quietly through academic circles. They would sit beneath fluorescent lights and study the small print, tracing the woman's fingers, the boy's outline, the unnatural calm frozen between them. and almost without exception, they would linger too long on the child's face. Some reported a sense of pressure behind the eyes. Others spoke of a faint impression that the photograph was waiting, not passively, but attentively. One archivist claimed that, while reshelving the file late one evening, she noticed a detail she swore had not been there before. The boy's mouth, she said, seemed less rigid, the corners softened just slightly, as if caught between stillness and the beginning of a smile. The photograph was immediately re-examined. No changes were officially documented. The paper showed no signs of alteration. The archivist was advised to take time off. The cemetery where the boy was buried still exists, though the tree above his unmarked grave was cut down decades ago. The ground has settled completely now, smooth and unremarkable. Nothing there suggests disturbance. Nothing suggests absence. Yet those who know where to stand sometimes report an odd sensation, a feeling that the space is both occupied and empty at once, like a room that remembers furniture long removed. As for the woman, she is remembered kindly. Locals described her as devoted, reserved, a mother who endured more than most. No one ever accused her of wrongdoing. If she noticed the boy's stillness, his silence, his failure to change, she never acknowledged it. Perhaps she understood something others did not. Or perhaps understanding was unnecessary. The photograph remains, quietly doing what it has always done. It does not move. It does not change. It does not announce its secret. It simply presents a moment of human closeness that asks a single, unbearable question of anyone who looks too closely: how much of what we accept as love is built on recognition, and how much is built on our willingness to ignore what stands in front of us, as long as it stays close, stays familiar, and never reminds us of what we have already buried.